He dug her from a snowdrift at dusk. Her wedding ring was engraved to his brother. The shovel hit something that wasn't ground. I thought it was a root. We'd had 3 days of hard freeze, and the snow had a crust on it thick enough to hold a man's weight if he stepped careful. But underneath it was still soft and deep in the draws. And I'd been digging the horse out of a low spot for 20 minutes already, and my arms were gone to water, and my lungs were burning in the cold. So when the blade scraped something solid and gave back a dull thud, I figured root. Figured I'd have to work around it. I cleared another foot of snow. It was a boot. I dropped the shovel and went to my knees and started pulling with both hands, and I had her out to the waist before she made a sound. Not a word. Just a noise low in her throat, like something coming awake that wasn't sure it wanted to. Her face was the color of creek ice, and her lips had gone past blue to a kind of ash. I got my arms under her and lifted, and she wasn't light. She was dead weight, and I carried her the 40 yards to the line shack and kicked the door in because I didn't have a hand to work the latch. I put her down on the bunk and got the stove going, and I didn't think about anything except heat. I had her coat off and her boots off, and I checked her hands and feet and rubbed them until some color came back. She didn't speak. She looked at the ceiling with those ice-gray eyes and breathed, which was enough. I found out her name was Nora when she told it to me, sometime around midnight when the shack had warmed enough that the ice had melted off the inside of the window glass. She told me other things after that, not all at once. Over 3 days, while the storm blew and neither of us was going anywhere, she gave me pieces of herself the way you give pieces of yourself to someone when you're not sure you're going to live, and it seems wasteful to take them back into the ground with you. I'm going to tell you the whole of it, or as much of it as I carry. Some parts I have to work up to. Some parts I still haven't found the right words for after all these years, but I'll get there. My name is Caleb Marsh. I was 41 years old that winter, and I had been 41 years old in the worst possible way, which is to say I had outlived the things I thought would kill me and was waiting around to see what finished the job. I'd come back from the war 7 years before, or what passed for coming back. My body came back. The rest of it stayed somewhere in the mud outside a town in Georgia whose name I still won't speak aloud. When I got home to Harlan County, there was nothing home anymore. My father 2 years in the ground, the farm sold for taxes, my mother living with a cousin she barely knew. My brother Thomas had been luckier. Thomas had always been luckier. He'd been posted out west early in the war, cavalry out of Fort Laramie, never saw the worst of it. When it ended, he stayed out west, found land in the Montana Territory along a creek that ran clear and cold even in August, built a house on it, found a woman. I got a letter from Thomas in the spring of 1869. He'd married. He wrote about the land, about the house he was still building, about the woman, a widow from Cheyenne, her first husband taken by fever, no children. He wrote that he was happy. I wrote back and said I was glad, which was true, and then I folded the letter into a tin box and went back to not having a direction. I drifted. That's the honest word for it. I worked cattle drives, worked a mine outside Leadville for 2 winters, did a season as a deputy in a town in Wyoming that I left when the marshal turned out to be dirtier than the men he was paid to run in. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly. I was just a man with no claim on any piece of ground and no reason to stop moving. Thomas wrote twice more in those years. The house was finished. They had a small herd. He was thinking of putting in wheat. The last letter came in the fall of 1871. He had broken his leg working the horses. Nora, he called her by name for the first time, had said it herself, had kept him in bed for 6 weeks and run the ranch alone without complaint. He wrote that down like it still amazed him. I never wrote back to that one. I don't know why. Something in me felt the distance between us too sharply to bridge it with words on paper. In the winter of 1873, I was working a ranch outside Bozeman when the word reached me. Thomas was dead. Horse had thrown him on frozen ground and he'd hit his head on a rock and he was gone before anyone found him. He was 36 years old. I rode to the ranch. It took me 11 days in hard cold. When I got there, the house was dark and I thought for a moment I'd come to the wrong place. But there was smoke from the chimney and a light in the back room. And I knocked and Nora opened the door and looked at me for a long moment and said, "You must be Caleb." Thomas had kept a photograph of me from the war. She'd looked at it enough to recognize me by a coal oil lamp 7 years later. I stayed 3 days and helped her with what needed doing, and then I left because I didn't know how to stay. I told myself she had people, a neighbor, a woman in town who'd been kind to her, and she didn't need me standing around in her kitchen not knowing what to do with my hands. That was what I told myself. The real reason, which I understood only later, was that being in that house made me feel things I didn't have the equipment to handle. Not for Nora, not then, not in any way I could have named. But the house was full of Thomas, his boots by the door, his hat on the peg, his handwriting on the deed pinned above the desk. I had spent years being nothing, and walking into the life my brother had built made me understand exactly how nothing I was, and I couldn't breathe with that understanding sitting on my chest. So I left. I went back to drifting. Another year, another 2 years. I was moving north through Wyoming when the weather turned mean early in October, and I pushed too hard to make the next settlement and got caught in the first real blizzard of the season about 8 miles east of nowhere. I found the line shack by accident, stumbled on the fence line, and followed it until the shape of the roof showed through the snow. And that is where I found Nora. She told me later, the second day, I think, when she'd slept enough to get some color back and some of the ice had gone out of her eyes, that she had been heading south. She'd held the ranch through Thomas's death, and the year after and the year after that, and then a bad drought had come and taken the wheat and the hard winter had taken 6 of the cattle, and she'd made the decision to sell. There was a cousin in Colorado, a woman she'd known as a girl, who'd written to say she had a room. Nora had sold everything that would sell and loaded the rest onto a pack horse and started south in late September thinking she'd beat the weather. She hadn't beaten the weather. She'd lost the pack horse crossing a frozen creek. The ice had given way and the horse had gone through, and she'd barely gotten herself clear. And when she'd climbed out on the far bank, she was soaked to the knees, and the temperature was dropping and the snow had started. And she'd gotten turned around in the low country and walked into a draw, and the snow had come down so hard and fast that she'd gone under before she knew it was happening. She said this without drama. She stated it the way you state weather facts. The horse went through, I went into the draw, the snow came down. The end of her life in Montana told flat. I sat across from her in that small shack with the stove putting out what heat it could, and I looked at her hands wrapped around the tin cup, and I didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Thomas wrote about you." I said, "What did he write?" "He said you were the steadiest man he knew," she said. "He said in the war, when things were bad, the men around you stayed calmer because you were calm. He said he always thought you'd be the one who was fine." I thought about that. "He was wrong," I said. "I know," she said, and looked at me with those gray eyes and nothing in them except honesty. We were stuck there 4 days. The storm didn't let up for 3. On the 4th day it stopped, and I dug out and checked the horses. Mine had weathered it in the lean-to, and came back inside, and said I could get her to the settlement at Garrison Flats in 2 days' riding if the weather held. She said, "What are you headed toward?" I told her I didn't know. South generally, it was true. She said she was headed south too, toward Colorado. She said if I was going that direction anyway she wouldn't object to the company, and if I'd rather travel alone she understood, and she said both of these things in the same even tone, no pressure in either direction, just a woman stating facts and leaving the choice to me. I said I'd ride with her to the Colorado line at least. We rode out the next morning, her on my horse and me on a dun I'd traded for in the settlement after I'd gotten her some food and dry gear. The sky was clean and hard blue, and the snow on the flats was blinding white, and we rode south and didn't talk much that first day, which suited me. I've never been a man who needs to fill silence. Toward evening she dropped back beside me and said, "You have the ring." I looked at her. I hadn't said anything about the ring. "I found it on the bunk," she said. "I dropped it in the shack when you were changing out my gloves. I should have asked for it back, but I didn't want to make it into something. It's just a ring." I reached into my coat pocket and put it in her hand. She looked at it for a moment and then put it in her own pocket. "I found the engraving," I said. "I wasn't prying. I saw it." She nodded. She rode another quarter-mile. Then she said, "He asked me to wear it for the winter. He didn't want me to be alone in the territory without some man's name attached to me. He knew how men thought about a woman alone out here. It was practical, and I let it be practical." I said, "Whose name?" She said, "His father's brother, an uncle who died in the war before I ever met Thomas. The ring had been the family ring, and he'd had it re-engraved because he wanted me to have something old." I didn't say anything. She looked at me. She said, "It was never yours." I said I knew that. She said, "I don't think you did." I'll slow down here, because this is where it matters. There's a thing that happens to men like me, men who have been alone a long time, men who have been moving and not arriving anywhere, where your mind starts filling in stories to explain things without letting the real explanation get a word in. I had looked at that ring and I had known, somewhere below the level of thought, that it said Marsh. I had felt something shift in my chest that I didn't examine. And I had ridden north all those years ago from Thomas's house telling myself I was leaving because she didn't need me, when what I was really doing was leaving because I was afraid of what I might want and ashamed of myself for wanting it. Nora knew this. She said it plainly, riding south in the last of the winter light with the snow throwing back the orange of the setting sun, because she was the kind of woman who said true things and let them sit. She said, "I'm not telling you this to make something of it. I'm telling you because you've been carrying something crooked in you since we left that shack, and I'd rather you know what is and isn't true than have you run from something that doesn't exist the way you ran from me before." The way you ran from me before. She said it just like that. I pulled up my horse and she rode on 2 lengths, and then pulled up 2 and half-turned in the saddle and looked at me. I said, "I didn't run from you. I left because you had people and you didn't need another loose end around your kitchen." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Caleb, Thomas was 3 months in the ground and you stayed 3 days and then you left without looking back. And I stood in the doorway and watched you go and I thought, well, that's that." I said, "That's what?" She said, "Whatever I thought it might be, which was probably foolish on my part, so let's leave it." She turned the horse and started south again. I sat there in the snow. Here is what I know about Nora, the things that came through over the weeks of riding south. She had been born in Missouri, the second of 5 children, daughter of a school teacher and a woman who raised pigs and took no nonsense from anyone. She had learned to read from her father and learned everything else from her mother. She had married her first husband, a man named Greer, at 19 because he was a good man and she thought good men were common. Greer had died of river fever at 24, and in dying he had taught her that good men were not common and that the world had a way of taking the ones you found. She had gone west the year she turned 26 because she could see no reason to stay in Missouri, and she had heard the territory was land a person could actually own. She had taken work as a seamstress in Cheyenne, and she had met Thomas at a church supper, and she had been careful with herself about him for almost a year because she had learned caution. And then she had stopped being careful because Thomas had been patient and kind, and had not pretended to be anything other than what he was. She said he was a good man too. I seemed to find them and then lose them. I said, "Maybe the losing is done." She looked at me, then looked back at the trail. She said, "That's the most thing you've said in 3 days." I said it didn't feel like nothing. She said it didn't sound like nothing. We hit the Colorado border 12 days out from Garrison Flats. 12 days of riding and camping, and splitting the work the way two people split work when they've both been doing things alone for so long they don't have to negotiate it. She cooked when I was still on the horses. I had the fire going when she was still unpacking. The chores just divided themselves. At the border I pulled up. She stopped and looked at me. I said, "I told you I'd ride to the Colorado line." She said, "Yes." I said, "I've ridden to the Colorado line." She said, "Yes." I said, "I don't have anywhere to be." She looked at me for a long moment. Her coat was buttoned up high, and there was a strand of dark hair that had come loose from her hat, and she didn't push it back. The mountains were south of us, big and white against the blue sky. She said, "I'm going to my cousin Vera's in a town called Lander. It's 3 days south of here. The road is supposed to be good. I imagine I could find it on my own." I said, "I imagine you could." She said, "But you could come." I said I could come. She said, "If you wanted." I said, "Nora." She turned and looked at me straight on with those gray eyes, and the loose strand of hair moving in the wind, and something in her face that was not soft, and not fragile, and not in need of being handled carefully. Something that had been tested hard and was still standing, and was standing right now in front of me asking me plainly whether I was going to stay or go. I said, "I have spent 7 years getting nowhere in particular, and the last 4 weeks are the first time I have been anywhere that felt like somewhere. I want to ride to Lander with you, and then I'd like to see what happens after Lander." She said, "Well, come on then." She turned the horse south. Vera was a small, red-haired woman with a husband named Price and 3 children under 8, and a house that was already full and knew it. She welcomed Nora with arms around her and looked at me over Nora's shoulder with eyes that asked a question, and I had no answer to give her yet. I stayed in Lander. I put up at the hotel for a week, which was all the money I had, and then Vera's husband Price pointed me toward a livery operation that needed a man who could work horses, and I went to work there, and I was good at it, which I had always been. And inside 6 weeks I had enough to put a small stake down on a room at a boarding house, and I was known in town as a man who was straight and careful, and could be trusted with a horse. Nora came to the livery on a Thursday, the 2nd week I was there. She stood at the fence rail and watched me work a 3-year-old bay who had a bad habit of cutting left when asked to go right. I didn't stop working. She didn't call out to me. She just stood there and watched with her forearms on the fence rail. After about 20 minutes, the bay decided going right wasn't the worst thing in the world, and I brought him down to a walk and took him to the rail, and Nora reached out and let him smell her hand and then scratched behind his ear, and he dropped his head and she said, without looking at me, "You're good with them." I said, "Horses are honest. They tell you what they're feeling." She said, "I know some people like that." I said I figured she did. She looked at me then. She said, "I'm helping Vera until spring. After that I don't know. Vera's lovely, but I'm not made to be someone's guest." I said, "No, I don't imagine you are." She said, "Price says there's ranch land north of here, 10 miles or so, went for taxes. Nobody's touched it since the previous owner died. He says it could be good grazing land with some work." I said, "He mentioned the price." She said, "He said it wouldn't break a man who'd been saving." I said I hadn't been saving long. She said, "No, but you've got a skill and a reputation and a livery man who'd put your name on paper. I've got a little left from selling Thomas's land. Together it might be enough." She said, "Together?" I looked at her over the bay's neck. She said, "I'm not proposing anything. I'm talking about land." I said, "I know you are." She held my eyes. I said, "I'd like to look at the land." She said, "Saturday." I said, "Saturday." The land was good. It was better than good. It sat at the foot of a long ridge that broke the worst of the north wind, and there was a creek that ran clear, and the grass under the snow was deep and hadn't been overgrazed. The house was a ruin, 3 walls and a roof that had caved in on one end, but the bones of it were sound, and the rock foundation was solid, and a man who knew how to work would have it weathered in before the cold came back. We walked every part of it that Saturday. Nora didn't chatter. She looked at things carefully and asked practical questions. How deep would the well need to go? What was the timber situation on the ridge? Was the creek in a flood draw? I answered when I knew and said I didn't know when I didn't. By the time we got back to where the horses were tied, the sun was low and the cold had come back into the air, and she stood looking back at the land with her hands in her coat pockets. She said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think it could be something." She said, "Yes." We rode back to Lander mostly quiet. At the edge of town she pulled up and I pulled up beside her. She said, "Caleb, I want to ask you something and I want a straight answer." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Are you still running?" I looked at her. She said, "I don't ask it mean. I ask it because I've watched you for 4 weeks and I can see you're a steadier man than the one who left my doorway 7 years ago, and I want to believe the difference is real and not just the winter and the road. I need to know if you wake up one morning and feel the itch and you'll be gone, because I can't." She stopped. She said, "I built something with Thomas and I watched it go. I'm not going to build something and watch it go again, so I need to know." The light was going gold on the mountains and the town was lit up below us, and the horses stood still in the cold. I said, "The thing I was running from was what I thought I might feel, and I was ashamed of it because you were my brother's wife. Thomas has been dead 3 years. And I have not stopped thinking about you once in those 3 years, except to push the thought away because I thought it made me a disloyal man. I am telling you this because you asked for a straight answer, and I am done pushing it away." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Thomas told me once in the last year that he wished you'd come back and settled nearby. He said you deserved better than the road. He said you were too good a man to spend your life going nowhere." I didn't say anything. She said, "So did he know?" I said, "Know what?" She said, "That you loved me." The word landed like a stone in still water, and I felt it go all the way to the bottom. I said, "I don't know what he knew." She said, "I think he knew. I think that's why he said it." I thought about Thomas. About the letter he wrote when she'd run the ranch alone for 6 weeks and he'd still been amazed by her. About the way a man writes about a woman when he's proud and grateful and a little undone by her. I thought about a man who might have known, with the quiet understanding of a brother, what went unspoken. I said, "He was a better man than me." She said, "He was a good man. But he's gone and I'm here and so are you, and I'm asking you to stay." She reached across the space between the horses and put her hand on my arm, her gloved hand on my coat sleeve, and held it there, steady, plain, not asking me for anything I hadn't already said I'd give. Just her hand on my arm in the cold with the gold light going off the mountains. That was the moment, not a word, just her hand. I put my hand over hers and held it. We sat like that in the cold for a while, the horses breathing steam, the town lights coming up below us, the mountains going from gold to purple to dark. We bought the land in March. The papers were signed in Price's name as a witness, and a lawyer in Lander, who had a steady hand and no particular curiosity about our arrangement, which was simply that 2 people with means had pooled those means toward a piece of ground. The first thing we did was clear the ruined end of the house. I worked the timber myself, Nora beside me pulling nails and stacking what could be salvaged and burning what couldn't, and we didn't talk much, but we were side by side the whole of it, and there is a kind of conversation that happens in shared work that doesn't need words. We were married in June. Vera's husband Price and 2 other men from town as witnesses, a preacher who came out on a Thursday because that was the day he rode that circuit. We stood on the repaired porch of a house that was still half rough and half done, and it was 70 degrees and the creek was running clear, and the grass was green up to the ridge. The preacher was a fast man who said his words briskly and moved on. When it was done, Vera cried, which embarrassed her, and Price shook my hand. Nora looked at me the way she looked at things she was deciding, level and careful and without hurry. Then she reached up and put her palm flat against my chest, over my heart, and held it there a moment, feeling my heartbeat, and I understood that to be the most serious thing she had done in the ceremony. I put my hand over hers the same way I had in the cold, on the road into town, the first time. We stood like that on the porch while Price poured whiskey into cups and Vera wiped her eyes and the creek ran cold, and the grass moved in a warm wind off the ridge. That was 31 years ago. I'm 72 now and I don't move as well as I did, but I move, and the ranch is what it was meant to be. 160 acres with good grass and the creek and a herd that doesn't embarrass us. We've had hard years. 2 bad winters, 1 summer drought, a horse sickness in 1887 that killed 4 of our best and nearly broke us. We had a son, James, who is 30 now and works the north pasture, and has a wife of his own and a daughter who has Nora's gray eyes. I wake up every morning in the same house I half rebuilt with Nora's help 30 years ago, and I drink coffee that she has made, and I look out the window at the ridge and the creek, and I think about the version of me who was going to drift forever. Some mornings she's already on the porch when I come out, coffee in both hands, looking at the mountains the same way she looked at the land that first Saturday, careful and taking stock, and not in a hurry. I sit down beside her, and she hands me the cup, and we sit there in the early light, and I don't know that I have ever in my life needed a word from her in those moments. There is a drawer in the kitchen chest, third from the bottom, with a few things in it that have no place else to go. Thomas's photograph, the one she kept, a letter from my mother, the last one she wrote before she died, a piece of paper with the description of the land as it was written in the deed, and a ring with an engraving I cannot read anymore because the metal has worn smooth with years. I found it in the drawer once, maybe 10 years back, and held it up to the window light and couldn't make out the letters and asked Nora whose name had been there. She said, "Someone who is gone." I set it back in the drawer. She said, "There is only one name that matters now." I looked at her. She was standing at the stove, her back to me, stirring something, and she said it to the stove the same way she'd said the important things without fanfare, flat and true, like weather. I put the ring back in the drawer and went and stood behind her at the stove and put my hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and covered it with hers. We stood like that until the food was done. That is the whole of it, or near enough. A man who was going nowhere, a woman who pulled him out of the cold. A piece of ground they built into something real. The love of a good woman given freely, and without asking anything in return except that he stay. He stayed.